Hi everyone, I'm Adonai.
Hi, I'm Amanda.
And I'm Naomi. And we are the 1 to 100 Architecture Podcast. That was insane. God damn.
That was so good. That was like harmonised. From Ackroyd Lowry, I'm Oliver Lowry.
And I'm John Ackroyd.
And this is Urban Forecast, the show where we talk to the people defining the future of our cities. We discuss their background, what drives them, and the insights they've learned along the way.
This is a podcast for anyone who's interested in how we live, work or play in the cities of the future and what that means for the built environment today.
Thanks so much, guys, for coming in. I've never done a podcast with so many people all at once, so this is going to be a lot of fun. So we always like to get kind of behind the people that are like influencing the industry, making changes in the industry. So could you tell me a little bit about how the 1 to 100 podcast started and, you know, what was the origin story of this amazing media empire you're growing?
Yeah, media empire.
Wow.
Yeah.
We're getting there.
We'll get there. But I think, we started during the pandemic, COVID, lockdown. And I think we started, most of us were furloughed or we had finished, we came out of uni. We spoke about starting a podcast while we were in third year of uni and then never manifested. And then, you know, during lockdown, we had so much free time, we didn't really know what to do. It was another way of like actually keeping in touch with each other. So we all met at university and we just decided, let's try. I think we were also very frustrated with trying to find a job in architecture and we wanted to talk about it. And we spoke about it amongst ourselves. And then we said, I think other people might want to listen to this as well. And that's kind of how it began.
And so were you all part twos at the time when you were furloughed or part ones?
Part one. So we were literally fresh out of uni, sort of no idea of where we were going and had like all of these questions about what the industry was, what even is an architect after you graduate from architecture, because that was a completely different question to what is architecture. And then it was a matter of who do we need to meet in this industry as well. And I think at that point, a lot of us started realizing that it's more about the connections, who you know, as opposed to just like your CAD drawings and just your portfolio submissions and all that kind of stuff, which is probably not what we got from the end of university, to be honest.
So had you all had jobs and then were furloughed? So you had some insight into like what it is like working in the industry?
Not all of us, no. I think some of us took the time to figure out if that's the route that we want to go into. For example, myself and maybe two other girls were just like, maybe this might not be the route for me. And some of us just needed that break from studying an intense course. And then I think who out of the group was actually studying
first?
I was working, but I struggled. I wasn't actually working as a part one architectural assistant. My first job was as a CAD technician. I had just gotten the job, I think, in the February of that year, and then I was furloughed for like a few months. So literally just starting, and I was doing detailed drawings. I had no idea what that meant. It was a steep learning curve.
But I think it was good, like, because it was like your way
into the industry. Yeah, definitely.
And what was the sort of did you have like a manifesto? You know, what was the purpose of the podcast? Was it just to express frustration, or was it to try and gain understanding through like discussing the difference between your experience at university and then this industry?
I think it was more sort of definitely expressing our frustration, but more coming from an educational perspective in terms of like, okay, these are the barriers that we're facing that we probably didn't even acknowledge them as barriers until our next season. Wow, I can't believe we were going through all of these things. And I think that was the sort of main aim of the podcast, was to be able to reach other people. So when we first started, one of the things that we did was, you know, who else is doing something like this? You know, who else has a podcast? Because actually, I guess we wouldn't have really even needed to start the podcast if something else like this was out there. So that was one of the things, is why are people not talking about this? Or like, where are all the potential architects and what happened to them in the course of the process between finishing uni and qualifying? So I know that was a question for me anyway. I was just like, am I missing something? Am I going into the wrong industry, like what's going on basically. And so it's more out of curiosity more than anything.
And how do you think that's changed over how long has it been that you're running it now?
It's gonna be 4 years.
Wow. And so what has there been like an evolution of what it is that you're trying to scratch and discover?
Definitely. I think for each of us, if you were to ask that question, we would all say something different, but also something quite similar. I think it's evolved more than a podcast. We initially started as a way to connect with one another and keep in contact and also share our frustrations and share with the world. And it was going to be a podcast and it was going to be something light, something casual to do. Then it evolved into something bigger than we actually anticipated. And it's a good thing. However, I don't know if at times we're just like, wow, we actually maybe took on something we didn't plan for.
We weren't expecting that at all.
So we're in the process of, becoming more than the podcast and setting ourselves up to actually, do more projects. So obviously last year was a year where we did community engagement and workshops, and that's obviously something that we didn't think of, or maybe we thought of, but we never thought that we would actually follow through with that. So yeah.
And do you think now that you've been doing it for a while, and that there wasn't somebody in that space, are you now sort of like, do you feel that responsibility? Are you representing people's voices?
I think we are. I think it was actually very surprising, at least for me, when we started the podcast. We also got onto Clubhouse, and I think that's when we really blew up, and that's when we really got to engage with our audiences and have these types of conversations with normal people and people that were from a similar background and people that had the same kind of questions. And so it was really amazing to see. And then it kind of reinstated that feeling of, our voices matter in the industry. There aren't people that come from, there are people definitely that come from where we come from, but maybe, the difficulty of navigating from the architecture industry or education, from our particular backgrounds as women and as women of colour, it is very difficult, and you don't hear that a lot. So definitely it's been something that we've had many messages from our listeners as well, saying thank you for your advice and, really sweet emails and things like that. We've genuinely helped people in getting the message out there, which, gives me fulfillment. It warms my heart, I'm not going to lie.
No, it's nice.
So do you want to talk about some of the projects that have come out of the podcast that have sort of spun off from it?
Yeah, definitely. So I think the biggest one was probably the People's Pavilion project. So that was in collaboration with Beyond the Box consultants. And basically, as part of the People's Pavilion, they choose certain collaborators to sort of host either events or workshops that basically aim to introduce young people into architecture, like sort of a soft way to introduce them into architecture and design. So we decided to hold free podcasting workshops. That was the first time we'd done that, and I think we sort of imposter syndrome sort of kicked in, like, oh, what do we know about podcasting?
Press record.
Literally press record, and that is about it. And then it sort of transpired into getting into public speaking. Then we're like, what do we know about public speaking? So it was quite interesting. But then we then sort of ended up creating this really incredible documentary called What's Your East London, where we got the participants to basically interview random people in Leighton, Walthamstow, and sort of just different parts of East London, just sort of getting their idea of whether or not they basically feel as though they're part of the progression in terms of architecture, in terms of design, in terms of regeneration in their local area. And it's on YouTube now, but it was a really incredible experience to sort of start off on Zoom and then end up teaching other people on how to interview publicly. So it felt like a huge milestone in terms of our journey as well, for the podcast.
I'm interested in what the respondents sort of said. Do people in East London feel like regeneration is something that they are part of or something that happens to them? Did you have any sort of feedback on that one way or the other?
Yeah, I think the documentary was interesting because a lot of people, I think there was one person in particular who had lived in Hackney his entire life. And he said that it's really sad because actually he thinks at some point he'll be pushed out. I think he's 5 generations in living in Hackney, but, you know, that it's very unlikely that he'd actually be able to stay there. So it was quite interesting to hear how, you know, instead of sort of being this collaborative sort of, I don't know, to be like sort of collaborative community, we're almost taking people out of their homes. And I don't know if that's something that we can do. It feels like it's a wide responsibility, not just the responsibility of architects, but, you know, it's everyone's responsibility almost.
And I think you spoke before about this podcast being something to do with maybe trying to understand the difference between the industry and education. What are your reflections now, 4 years in, presumably 4 years into actually working within the industry, you know, give or take? How does the education system at the moment prepare you for real life? And who wants to take that question?
Go on, I don't know.
Triggered. Absolutely triggered.
I think, so when we first started the podcast, I've said this in like many episodes, but it's like almost like a journal. So we're talking and it's like almost like therapy. Like I'm saying all my ideas out there. And if you look at the first episode, I was like ready to go into architecture. And if you look in the last episode, I'm like, yeah, I'm going to do an architectural apprenticeship. And then we look now and I'm not even doing architecture now. So it's been like a nice way to reflect on my journey, because I think
you talked yourself out of it.
Yeah, basically. And I heard everybody else's experiences and I was just like, yeah, that's not for me. So it's been a great way to kind of like almost talk about it with my friends and be like, okay, guys, I'm really struggling to find a job. I'm really finding it difficult to find a place or find my place in architecture. So when I look at architectural education, sometimes if I look at the built environment as a whole, sometimes maybe architecture isn't for you, but it's okay because there's other, you know, things within the built environment that you can go into. So luckily for me, I started working in schools, and then I was like, okay, I still like architecture and I like working with kids. How can I bridge the two? And then that's how it's like developed for me, like working in community engagement, and now I'm doing my master's in urban design and looking at cities and still finding a way to like maybe go into consultancy. So I'm still like, I have my foot in the built environment or architecture through the podcast, but my architectural experience has helped me to kind of shape my own journey.
And I think, well, for me, architecture is cities anyway. You know, I think if you're doing urban design, that's still kind of architecture. I think, you know, like trying to split urban design and architecture up is, for me, mad. Like, I've spent my whole life trying to make this practice not somebody that just does buildings, but does, you know, thinks about the world in a strategic way at a city scale. So I think that's the role of the architect in any case. Yeah. And also for that to somehow reflect the people in those cities as well. Like, I think, you know, the worst case scenario is when architecture is done to a place and those people aren't brought on that journey with you. So I do think you're still an architect.
Yeah. I'm running away. Yeah. What about you guys?
Me? What was the question?
Well, you're still within what is a traditional architect's role.
I am.
And what's your reflection about how the education system prepares you for that?
It's just a very long career. It is a long time in education. So I think the standard is 7 to 10 years before you qualify as like a traditional architect. I think the industry, it's interesting speaking to different people, because I think the industry right now is changing quite a lot, and I think a lot faster in a way that I think maybe many educational bodies can't really anticipate for, like AI and, you know, maybe sustainability. The role of the architect and what that means for people who are studying or entering that industry is actually very difficult to navigate. And that's something that we've spoken about in the podcast, because we're just like, what is the role of the architect now? What does it mean? Will architects exist in the next 50 years? Or will we get pushed out into something else? You know, developers are the new thing, and obviously we don't get paid very well. So I think it's a very difficult question to answer.
I think that schools should probably teach a broader overview of the property industry.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
For sure.
think that
About
really,
state.
if you don't understand property, there's only a certain amount of architecture that you're going to be able to do. And that's
Yeah.
going to be either house extensions, where you don't really need to know much about the property industry, or like monumental museums. But and those two very extremes, the rest of architecture really sits within the property industry. And it's
Yeah.
about understanding like land values and
Yeah.
economics and the
Yeah.
economics of land. And if that were taught, I think there's plenty of other, as you say, detours that you could make within your career. Because for sure, what you
I
could say is,
agree.
does an architect exist in 50 years? Don't know. Will people still need places to live? People will still be trading land in 50 years? 100% they will.
sure.
You know, so we should be preparing people to be able to navigate that. Rather than design on your own, like in this arbitrary way, where I've never since leaving university ever designed anything on my own. The only time I ever did it was at
exactly,
university.
exactly.
It seems like a totally crazy
Yeah,
experience.
I
That's
think
not
they
how
need more
buildings get built.
nuance. Yeah, I think the traditional route isn't.
It doesn't
Yeah.
work.
It's not
No,
work.
it doesn't work.
It's not working right now. Need to think outside the box. But I think there's a lot more entrepreneurs in the architecture industry than I actually thought there was. I don't know if that's like a new trend or that's a new thing, or maybe that's
it's a
always been
trend.
like that.
I think it's sort of what you're pushed out to do anyway. Like when you finish your part 3, you become an architect, and I guess the next step then is to start your own practice.
Yeah,
I don't know. I'm
But I
assuming I
don't-
haven't actually done my
Yeah,
part
I
3.
don't know. I
Yeah,
don't know if
Oliver,
that's.
you can
Yeah, there
answer.
we
You can
go.
answer.
Well, I got my part 3 and I set up quite quickly. I think so. I gave a lecture recently at London South Bank, and I think there's 3 ways of running an architecture practice. This is my theory. It might not be true. Way number 1 is you set up just after your kind of part 3. So that's what I did when you haven't got anything to lose. So you haven't got any kids, and it doesn't really matter if you mess up. So that's like Bjarke Engels. He did that. He set up really young. Like I think he basically did his part 2 basically, and then set up big, or what became big. Then you've got the second main way is that you set up, like you take a load of clients and you set up when you're old. So like Ken Shuttleworth, who's at Make, he was at Foster's. Everybody said, oh, he's the real designer at Foster's. He designed the Gherkin. So he took that credibility, and I think didn't part on bad terms, but certainly eventually some clients probably went with him from Foster's. But he was in his 50s. So he'd already built that reputation. And then there's the other way, which is like the Patrick Schumacher way, who's at Zaha, where, it's a succession thing where you stay within that company, you work your way up, and eventually you're kind of handed the reins. And I think those are the 3 ways. So, and the only way that I know is the way that I did it, which is like nothing to lose, just do it when you're young. But I think there are other ways to do it that are maybe less risky.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's not an easy thing to start a practice as well. I think it depends on also where you're coming from, because like, say for example, for myself, like coming from like a low economics, working class background, like to start in a practice is such a big deal. Like I don't think it's something that would just happen off the bat. And so I think that's also maybe why it's, for some people it wouldn't be a natural progression, because the knowledge and business acumen isn't actually there to start the practice.
I think it's also, but then again, I don't want to like elongate the already very long education of architecture, but I think it's very important at least to learn these kinds of starting up practice or business management really a lot earlier on, and what you're talking about real estate, because coming, at least for me, I'm just talking personally, which is that I didn't come from a place where I knew an architect or I had any architects in my family, or architecture wasn't really around me other than the house that I lived in. Maybe like public free museums that people get to go to as kids, and that's like their first introduction to architecture and things like that. But outside of that, it's very difficult to open up your eyes to something you haven't seen before. So when you start, and it's the same thing with like starting a practice, like if you don't have that coming from like your community or your home, the only place you can really get that from is from education. So if it's not coming from there, then YouTube, maybe, I don't know, like where you're gonna get it from. Or some people are very intuitive and that's how they do it. But
I totally agree. So that's we wanted to kind of crowbar in talking about our AL Academy, but so we're doing BTECs. So we're working with New City College, who've got campuses all across East London, well, it's mostly East London, to support their BTEC programme. And so they're mostly 16 to 18. You are opening people's eyes to the fact that the whole built environment exists, and they don't have to be architects, but we give them it's an equivalent to A-level or 2 A-levels. So.
Wow, that's incredible.
So we have them 2 days a week, and they've got to do 45 days across 2 years here, and then at the end of that they're eligible to go into a part 1, or they can do part 1 apprenticeship, so they would stay here. So we don't pay them for the BTEC, but then once they are on the apprenticeship part 1 scheme, they'll be paid as an apprentice, so on apprenticeship wage.
Yeah.
And we can get them all the way through, so we can do the part 1 and then the part 2 apprenticeship as well. So theoretically, within 10 years, we could get them qualified, and they'd never have to pay for anything, which is great. And they'd actually get paid for most of it.
Yeah.
And we think that's like the reason we're doing that is we want the practice should represent the city in which it serves.
100%.
And like traditionally, architecture students are coming from the home counties, middle class families, and then but the cities that we work in are made up of a totally different fabric socially. So we're trying to just work with the schools around us. Well, New City College, we've got several campuses, so that we can just advertise the fact. So our first thing is we go into the schools and do workshops, co-design things, which is quite fun, and then we do that with kids at about 12 to 16. Of those kids, some of them, so we've got 6 at the moment who are doing the BTEC in the built environment, and then that'll go down to, it sort of narrows down, because not all of them will want to go into the part 1 apprenticeship scheme, although they all say they do at the moment, so I don't know. Going to have to find where they're all going to sit. But, so it's really exciting. If you can give people a path, you will get people that are engaged. Like drive is different. Everybody's had a different background. What I want is enthusiasm, and if we can lay out a pathway, at the moment, all the 6 students that we've got, when I ask them, would you want to go on to do the apprenticeship course here? We're like, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, okay, great. That means you've got to turn up on time. You've got to treat this like a job.
Yeah.
This is like an interview for your next stage. And you've got to set up a LinkedIn account. You've got to post on LinkedIn. I'm setting them tasks. But they know about TikTok, which I don't know about. So Scarlett, who's 16... the most passionate she's been is when she was explaining what we should do in terms of our TikTok strategy. Like we are on TikTok. But she was like, oh my God, this is my world. And so she's now advising us on our TikTok strategy. And
That's incredible.
So you get little weird hooks into the things that will make them super enthusiastic. It's exciting.
It's nice that you're giving them a voice, actually, to be honest, because it's definitely a generational thing. TikTok anyway, social media, and like the running of architectural practices is, there's sometimes there's no synergy between the two of them. So it's nice that you're giving them a platform as young as they are to actually have impact on your practice.
But they're the only people in the whole practice that use TikTok. So they have
It's true. But I was also going to say, it's a great thing. One thing about the apprenticeship, because I am doing the apprenticeship right now as well, coming to the end of it finally.
It's too long.
It's so long.
The part 2 one doesn't need to be that long. I think
it's. I think that's the only thing. It's just the maintaining the momentum. Because the part 2 one, for anyone that doesn't really know, is 4 years. So you do 3 years, the equivalent of your master's, and then the final year you do your part 3. And back to back. You start September every single year. Finish in June, July. And it's just maintaining that momentum for 4 years straight while you're working and studying. And then if you've got anything else, like a podcast.
Well, for these kids, it would be 10 years, for them to qualify.
Exactly, yeah.
But
they'll be doing it younger.
Anyway, right? It's going to be, you're starting at 16. So, but what's the youngest you can qualify now? Probably 25 at a push. So it's kind of going to they're going to end up at the same point in time, but I do think you'll have quite a high fallout because it's just a bit monotonous. And I think the ARB and REBA need to look at the length of time that the apprenticeship qualifications are taking. You're learning so much more because you're learning in practice. They should be shorter than going to university, because how much do you learn in your job versus uni? I learned so little at university versus work. In part 1, that 1 year, I learned everything that I so much more. So I think the apprenticeship courses should be shorter than doing it at full-time uni.
100%.
I mean, it's an insane amount that you learn all at once. And I think in my summer breaks, it was only then I actually realized how much I was actually digesting from both my academic study and what I was learning in practice. And then the great thing about apprenticeships is that there's kind of a crossover where you can kind of have your academic work help your practice, and vice versa. And I think there should be more of that. It should be more encouraged. I don't think a lot of practices are very equipped or prepared for apprentices because they're not like normal workers. Of course, it's a very weird kind of grey line, because you are a full-time employee, like contractually, but at the same time you need to be doing your 20% off the job training, which is your studies. Some practices haven't always been very accommodating to that, and they treat you like a normal worker and kind of work you as everyone else, with, you know, knowing that you have all these other commitments that it's in their interest for you to pass as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's amazing that you're accommodating doing that.
Let's see how it
for
goes.
younger generation.
Yeah, we've only just started it, so there's a long way for them to go. But
No, I
it's
definitely
good to
resonate though with you saying about you learnt most of your things in practice, because I didn't learn anything at uni. Like I was honestly, it just went over my head. Like I didn't like any of my undergrad projects. I didn't even feel like they were completely finished. And so when I went into practice, I was so shocked. I was like, I can't believe they just hired me. And it was interesting because it turned out that, you know, I remember at the interview, I showed my now director my entire portfolio. And he's like, the only thing he said was, oh, I really like your layout. And I was like, spent so long on these drawings and you commented on my layout. But it was more about your personality. Do you get on would you get on with everyone in the team? You know, how do you fit in? Are you willing to learn? Are you driven? Are you enthusiastic? You know, I went into my interview knowing exactly what I wanted at the end. Did I go for it? Not really. But in the process of me being there 2 and a bit years now, I've completely changed. Like my personality has transformed. My career choices have changed. So I think you also need to know the type of person you are. You may not be an education-driven person. Maybe you need to be in practice to understand where you stand in the industry.
And a lot of people drop out before they get into practice.
Well,
I think.
exactly.
The other thing that, you know, really learned a lot from working in practice is the workflow and how you actually work within a team, because in undergrad and university it's so individualistic. It's your project, you're running it. I mean, I guess that's kind of necessary.
That's the thing that makes the least sense.
But right? Like when I get into practice, it's like I'm sharing files with other people, and
because it makes you think like you're going to be like Renzo Piano or, you know, Vignoli, just like sketching on the back of a
like
napkin,
you are the guy.
And then going like, it will be like this. It's like, where does that ever happen? Like, even now, when I run a company, what I say in a little sketch, that's never what it ends up being. One, nobody would listen to me. They're like, that sketch is shit. And then also, you like show it to a fire consultant, they're like, where's your second staircase? No. And then, like, you know, you talk to the planning consultant, they're like, no, it's too tall. You know, it never ends up being anything like what you think it's going to be like at the start. And if it did, well, I don't know. Those days are long gone. Now you've got so many consultants you've got to work with that your vision will always be. It's very rare that you just like make it so.
Yeah, the collaboration and the teamwork is just you don't really learn that much at university, which is like that's
why does it
everything.
Cost £100,000? Oh, it's crazy.
You need to give me my money back. That's what I want to do.
So Adonai, I'm going to spin it to you now to lead the conversation the other way around, but let's, you know, it's good to, I like the format that we had, but I feel like I need to be grilled now.
Okay, I'll start off by asking you about like your own, you know, architecture journey. Have you always wanted to be an architect? Like what kind of like got you into your foot into architecture, and have you been enjoying it? Well, I mean, you're still doing it.
Yeah, well, sometimes I enjoy it. No, so when I was at school, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And so I went to study art for a bit, and then I didn't really like that. I did what you were doing with architecture, where I was like, this is a bit pointless. And so I was interested in architecture because I felt like it was creative still, but it had a sort of practical outcome that you could kind of... What I found with art was that it was difficult to say whether something was good or bad. It was quite subjective, whereas I think it's easier with a building to understand whether it's successful or not. So...
Does it stand or does it not? Is the rule?
Oh, right, yeah.
It's a good point as to what is good architecture. I think, but I didn't know that it was so complicated. I just sort of thought what I liked is there was a real thing that was useful to people. And that's what drew me in. And undergrad, I was rubbish, and I've actually just reconnected with my tutor, Satwinder Samra at Sheffield, on LinkedIn. Because we're chatting about education and stuff, and I do want to just apologise to him for how bad I was, because I absolutely I didn't care really, and I couldn't see the point, and I didn't understand what I was meant to do and what was expected of me, and until the last term when my like brief for my made up fantasy project was a school. And suddenly, because I actually knew what, I just left school, right, a few years ago. And so I was like, I know what a good school might look like and a bad school might look like. And, I'd love to imagine what designing a school would, that was really fun for me. And then after I finished, I applied to Archetype because I looked on their website and I was like, oh my God, they do stuff that's like schools. And it's like they're creating these cool spaces for kids. And so then I worked for them. But I had that enthusiasm because I loved the idea of making spaces for young people to sort of thrive in, because it's like, it was just so immediate in my memory. And then I worked for Archetype for like 10 years and I loved it. But towards the end of it, I sort of felt like I loved everything about the company and I didn't see a route forward for me in it. I wanted to take all of the founding principles and apply them to a slightly different company. So I met John, my business partner, there. And we started discussing a lot about trying to take some of the ideas that Archetype aspire to on individual buildings and apply them to a city scale. And so we kind of wanted to be like ambitious about taking sustainable principles and applying them at an interconnected kind of city scale. So that was always the vision for the company. But then once set up and it was just us, and suddenly you just end up designing a load of house extensions for people. And so it took a very long time to build the business up into being impactful at the scale that we wanted it to be. And I think, you were talking about when do you learn some of these lessons around running a business. I do think running a business is one of those things that it's hard to teach on paper. Even if all of the tutors in architecture schools, if they had run companies, that probably would help, but it's really hard to quite teach somebody. It's one of those things, it's like riding a bike. You can only kind of teach it a bit by doing it. Some of these things you've kind of got to work out. But we've always we've always invested a lot in advice. And I don't think architecture tutors would ever be the right people to tell you how to run a business anyway.
No.
So we used a non-exec who came from a tech background. So our original non-exec, which was after about 3 or 4 years, I think we employed a non-exec who was like an advisor, came to our board meetings. And he was really good because he was the person that built Saphira, which is environmental modelling software, which got bought by Trimble, who owns SketchUp. So he had an oversight of how the architectural industry worked because he'd been selling into it. And so he had quite a lot of advice for us on what the typical mistakes architects sort of make are. And
tell us, what are they?
Well, so his advice very early on was he's like, do you want to do house extensions? We're like,
No,
well,
really.
we quite like them because it's reliable income. And he was like, so tell me, at the end of a really successful house extension project, what happens? And we're like, the people live in it. He's like, do they ever phone you up the week afterwards and go, I'm going to do another house extension? And we were like, no, of course not, right? Success means that they will never use you again because you've made them their dream home.
Yeah.
And he was like,
It's true.
if you get a good account with a developer, what happens when you finish a project? They ring you up for the next one. So he was like, so take all of the house extension projects off your website, stop telling people that you do them, and focus on the market of repeatable business. So business to business transactions where you have instead of it being a client, it becomes an account. And so that was one of the most sort of impactful pieces of advice ever, is to look for people where each building is not the end of the relationship with them. And so most of our clients, we've still got clients from 10 years ago when we started that we're still doing work with now. And that's what you want. That's why business to business transactions are a lot easier. They also take away the emotion a bit from it.
Yeah.
So that was very good advice.
No, that's incredible. And I really like what you said about the fact that it takes a long time to become impactful because it's a gradual process. And I think obviously you went into it with a mission and probably now you're still kind of building that mission for the practice. I really like to know what why are you doing this? What's your drive behind every day? Because I'm sure there are new challenges that pop up all the time. What's keeping you still active and still very enthusiastic about what you're doing?
Good question. So, I think you're right. So we try and have a reasonably consistent, top lines kind of why. So, I don't know if you've ever seen the Simon Sinek Power of Why.
I think
it's a little 5-minute talk on YouTube. It's really cool. And he's really good companies have a really clear why. So, Elon Musk's one for the SpaceX is he wants to take a step, it's get to Mars but not die or something like that. So he wants to land on Mars but not in a collision state. And so all of the decisions around his sort of business ecosystem is to try and drive towards getting to Mars. And I mean, our one's slightly less ambitious, but we think that our sort of guiding force is that we think that cities are the solution. So there's lots and lots of challenges, sustainable challenges, lack of resources, climate change, housing shortages and agricultural problems that mankind is facing. But we think that like cities are where the solution lies. I mean, it's not the whole solution but I don't know anything about agriculture, so I can't kind of fix that bit. But the thing that I can impact upon is like urban environments, and we think that like high density sustainable cities that are well supported by infrastructure around them offer humanity the best chance of surviving. They can be efficient, and they also need to kind of add delight, and they need to be walkable and joyous, and so that's the thing that drives us. And I think what we always wanted to do was we think that architects are reasonably low down the pecking order when it comes to the decision making around cities. At worst, you can feel like you're just window dressing a massing that's been dictated by a developer and a planning consultant, and that's rubbish. So why we do the podcast, and we do political engagement, and we do event series with politicians and people that are dictating policies, because we want our voice to carry more weight than you would usually get as an architect. So we want to kind of punch above our weight, and that's the thing that drives us, is to get outside of the lane of architecture and go, okay, how do we actually talk about the future of cities? I mean, this urban forecast, that's about future of cities. So that's what gets me out of bed every day. But bad days, you come in and you spend the whole day dealing with a collateral warranty and something that's gone wrong in a project, and sometimes that big mission stuff gets very hard to see.
Sort of put to the back a little bit. Yeah,
exactly. I think it's interesting. Who you hire changes a lot. When you start, you just hire anybody. You meet somebody in a bar and you're like, oh yeah, you want to be the office manager? You just kind of, and so what you assemble is this kind of slightly ad hoc hodgepodge of people that are like, who else would work for a startup? I mean, our office used to be a pub. Like when we started, we didn't have an office, so our friend had just bought the Star and Garter at the top. It's in Ridley Road Market, 3 compasses, and so we would just work in there in the daytime because there was nobody in this pub. And then who else would work for you like when that's your office? And then we signed like a really big contract, and so we suddenly needed to staff. But it was all so chaotic that the people that you get to work for you at that point are quite people that are like trying to set up their own thing and maybe just need a bit of cash. And then as we got this office and we start to professionalise somewhat, you still get those outlier people who want to work for a startup. But we're 10 years in now, and we want people that want careers. And that's those people are totally different. So we now try and set like a very clear vision around cities and the future of cities and what we believe, so that we can try and attract people that believe the same thing. So I think it's like setting out your stall is really important. People will jump on that wagon with you if you are clear about what it is that you believe, but not necessarily at the start.
I guess it takes a lot of trust for you and for them as well to sort of understand, okay, this is a startup, how far does my job sort of extend to, where's my career progression? And then for you also, who's taking on this random person, actually, are you gonna sort of make or break my company? So it's I guess it's a lot of risk involved in terms of who you take on as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think 10 years in, we can't really call ourselves a startup anymore.
No,
exactly. And the last person that we hired, Fina, is just like amazing. And never would have worked for us at the start because she's far too good and she never would have taken that crazy risk. But we're very privileged now that we're in a position where we can hire people as good as that. But that's not you don't have that at the start. You just kind of take what you can, and you work with friends a lot.
Do you think you would have worked for yourself if this wasn't your company?
No.
That's a good question.
That is a good question.
But I've only ever had one job. I've only ever done one job interview.
Wow.
So I'm not a very good example because I always wanted to work for myself. The only other person I wanted to work for was Bob Hayes, because he was the person that ran Archetype, and he was like inspirational. And I wanted to work for Archetype because I wanted to learn. And I never cared about that. You said architecture's not very well paid. I think it can be well paid. I think badly paid when you're in your kind of 20s and 30s. But I didn't care, because when I was in my 20s and I was working at Archetype, I was just learning. I was just like, I just wanted to absorb everything at that company. And I just thought, this is an investment in me. I'm going to use all this stuff. So I always felt that was the only person I ever wanted to work for. And then as soon as I wanted to work, I always wanted to work for myself. So, my head just flipped at a certain point where I was like, I'm not going anywhere here. So I'm going to do the thing I always wanted to do, which is take all that knowledge that I've soaked up over 10 years and start using it for myself.
Wow.
So I never would work for anybody else other than, Bob because he inspired me.
Yeah.
That's good. I got quite a few questions just off what you said. One is about client relationships. So like you said, when you first started in the pub, you had a big contract come in. Like how do you build those client relationships? And as a startup, how did you, go out there to get work?
Yeah.
Second question is just kind of flipping the question back to you, what you asked us. Looking back at your architectural education, you talked about you wanted to like apologize to your first year tutor. How did you how did you switch from the point of, okay, I want to work for myself? Because I feel like what you just said was such a key insight. I feel like a lot of us obviously want to, go into architecture. You want to get paid well. But I feel like the generation we're in now is like instant gratification. I want to get money. I want to be paid well. I want to live well. So I don't know. It's a balance of like trying to soak up and learn everything that I need to learn to start a firm for myself or to be the best I can be as an architect to gradually progress. So yeah, like looking back at your own journey, when was like that switch? And then last question, sorry.
God,
So sorry.
What's number one?
I wrote it down.
The last question is just looking at those around you in architecture school, did everyone have that kind of same mindset as you? As like, okay, I want to start my own firm for myself and I want to, I know that I need to invest in myself to learn what I need to learn to start my own firm because, yeah, I think not everyone has that mindset.
I'm going to do them in reverse order because I think that's easier. But I think the answers get shorter. The third question, the answer is no. I think, of the three people that I was closest to in my part two, like we were a little kind of gang of four. Me and another guy both set up a business at the same time. And his one didn't quite jump out of that house extension bit and eventually he folded. But the other two just stayed in practices and they were very happy there. And like certainly one of those people is actually working their way up within the companies and eventually they might end up running those companies. Different route, different risk profile. And that sort of leads to the second question, when did my switch in mentality happen? I remember it from the university holiday doing work experience and speaking to the boss and him saying, running a practice, it isn't for everyone. I don't want to do it. I like working here. I get paid, it's no risk. And I just remember thinking, it's not for me. I always wanted, my mum ran her own business. I always wanted to run my own business. I wanted that like feeling of I remember when we first set up sitting and we got this like desk rental in Shoreditch in this room with a load of like recruiters who were just on the phone all day, like recruiting people, go, hello, 360 recruitment. How can I help? It was just awful and it smelled of farts. But I just remember sitting there, we had like 2 employees and like John went off to go on holiday and I was like, it was my first time like running a business like on my own. I was like, I felt like a pirate at sea on a boat anyway, I could do anything, and that feeling, I always knew that was what I wanted. So I don't think I ever had a switch in mentality because that's what I knew I always wanted. But I don't think everybody does have that. I can't speak for everybody, but that was the way that I felt. And then to go back to your first question about how you win work, it's all about network and you guys know that. And that's what, you started out by saying that. We were lucky and every time you get a bit of luck, it's about how you capitalise on that. Any opportunity that happens, I will grasp, and we were in a position of being super lucky. My friend worked for a guy who ran a film studios and he wanted to build a film studio and he introduced us and like that was it. We had our office in the pub and we went to meet him in the pub and we signed a contract that was like an amazing project. So it's one of our still like it was highly commended at the AJ Retrofit Awards. It took a long time to build it, there were a lot of challenges, but once that opportunity was presented to us, we grabbed it with both hands and we're still working with that client 10 years later. So it's all about who you know and you've got to cultivate your networks. And when these people fall into those orbits, you've got to grab those opportunities and work as hard as you can with them, try and understand what they want, to try and assist them wherever possible and turn them from interested parties into clients and from clients into accounts and, keep those accounts going and make sure that you're constantly sort of, servicing that account and trying to anticipate what they might want next.
What's the difference between sort of, I guess, like almost working just for yourself or just with you and your business partner and having employees? Like, do you feel a sense of responsibility now towards them?
Yes, definitely. But the scariest thing is that feeling of like, if you don't make any money, then you can't pay your rent or pay your mortgage. That feeling is always there,
Wow.
And that's but now I feel it for other people too. I don't know. I still feel the same thing, you know. If we don't make money, then we don't pay ourselves. We don't pay other people. It's something you've got to get used to.
Is that something that, do you think starting a business or starting an architecture practice would you recommend it?
Is it a good thing?
Is it a good thing? Do we need more start-up architecture practices? It's quite a lot already around, no?
There's a lot of practices. I think this is why I say that I think people should study the property industry more. I don't think the world needs more architecture practices per se, but I do think they need more entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
And I think there's plenty of things that you can do within the industry that are maybe slightly different. I think that, you know, the world is changing so fast, not really just with AI, but I think the difference between when I started, who were the tech billionaires 10 years ago? Sorry, the billionaires 10 years ago were people in tech. The next set of billionaires are going to be people with like audience and reach. You're seeing a sort of tipping point where influencers now are have more impact than the brands they represent. A switch in alliance from one brand to another can be the making of the brand. When the fuck did that happen? And what does that mean for our industry? Now that, you know, we're obviously aware of the importance of audience, otherwise we wouldn't be on a podcast. But, you know, I think more people should be taking their own destiny into their own hands. And for me, that's by starting a business. You can impact other people as well. But the most important thing is that you can impact the direction of your own life. You know, you don't have to wait around and be a part 2 and then a part 3 and then a blah blah blah. You know, like you can just go, okay, I'm just going to do something. And that's cool. And it doesn't need to be your main thing. It can be something on the side. But I think more people should start businesses. I'm a big believer in entrepreneurship. And the other thing is like the importance of getting advice and then giving advice. And so I'm always like, I'm very open to giving people advice. I try and do it through this and through other things. And if any of you guys ever wanted advice, I'd be happy to do it because it's very fulfilling though. I love doing it. You know, it's like, I love giving advice on that startup bit's so exciting. I get to live vicariously and remember what it felt like.
Live through them.
Yeah, exactly.
Would you class yourself as an architect or an entrepreneur at this point in your
Entrepreneur
career?
first.
Okay.
Yeah. Entrepreneur first. Just happened to the architecture. That's me and John both think that way. I run a podcast. I run an event series. All of these things are in service of the main business, but I couldn't say that the main thing that I do is architecture. The main output of this company is designs buildings, but what I do now probably don't do that much architecture in any case, right? I have to understand it, but I also have to understand the property industry. And, you know, I would say I've always wanted to be an entrepreneur first. And that means that I'm okay with the fact that I'm probably not that much of an architect on a day-to-day basis.
That's really incredible, actually. That you
That's
said
actually
that.
kind of
It's very
interesting
humbling.
because some people, you know, really love to do the actual architecture versus some people might actually hate running a business. You know, it's to do with personality and kind of like what you want to get out of it as well.
Well, that's the thing that you've got to learn. And maybe, you know, if you ask the people that work for me, I'm sure they would say that I haven't, but like trying to let go and, you know, allowing other people to be the
That's
architect.
so funny.
That's the most important thing, you know. And
you don't really
ultimately-
think about that,
Ultimately trying to allow people to run the business too. You know, I don't want to, if you look at senior people, does Norman Foster get involved in chasing debts and accounts out there? You know?
You've got to let
And he doesn't
go.
probably get involved in the design, he's just the chairman. And I think it's that, you know, that evolution, the successful people can learn to let go. But it is hard. It's hard. You are drawn back to wanting to design everything.
Thank you
Thanks very much, guys. Cheers.
Yeah.
If you enjoyed the show, then please subscribe and give us a review, ideally a 5-star one. And if you want to know more, please go to ackroydlowry.com or follow us on Twitter @ackroydlowry and Instagram with the same. This podcast supports Landaid, the property industry charity that brings together the sector to deliver life-changing projects for young people who really need it. Visit www.landaid.org to find out how you can help end youth homelessness.